He was chasing a wounded deer and was sure he knew this forest better than anyone. But one strange scream led him to a place that doesn't exist on any map. Where there should have been a wall of trees, a perfect passage opened, and from that step on, his life was never the same. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which country you're watching from. Marcus West had spent more than half of his adult life walking the same national park. The service badge clipped to his uniform had faded from sun and rain long ago, the edges worn smooth by decades of use, but he had never once thought about replacing it. It was part of him now, just like the quiet confidence with which he moved through the forest, reading the ground as easily as most people read a newspaper. Every creek had a personality to him. Every ridge carried a memory of storms survived or fires contained, and every tree line told him where the land rose or fell even when the terrain lay hidden under fog. He had not started his career with grand ideals of heroism or adventure. In the beginning, he had simply wanted steady work and a place where the noise of cities could not follow him. Over the years, however, the park had shaped him into something precise and restrained. He noticed when a branch was bent at the wrong angle, when the soil held a trace of metal, when a silence felt heavier than it should. The forest, to Marcus, was not mystical. It was a system, a breathing network of signals, and if you listened long enough, it told you everything. The park itself was enormous, far larger than most visitors ever realized. There were the front-facing zones, the scenic overlooks with paved paths and information boards, the trails tourists shared online with smiling selfies and filtered sunsets. And then there were the places behind the signs, behind the warnings and locked gates. The deep protection zones where rare species nested, where the land was too fragile to absorb careless footsteps, where the radio signal thinned and disappeared. These regions were mapped in internal documents and discussed quietly among staff, but they were not part of the public story. They were the lungs of the park, places that kept it alive while the world admired its surface. When the call came in that morning, Marcus was finishing a routine inspection of a camera array near the western ridge. The report was brief but troubling. Several hikers had claimed to see a wounded deer staggering near the boundary of one of the restricted areas. One of the motion sensors had caught a glimpse of it earlier in the week, and the image suggested a serious injury. That alone would have warranted a check, but the coordinates were close to a zone where no one should have been, and animals rarely strayed there unless something was very wrong. Marcus did not hesitate. He logged his departure time, grabbed the field kit that included a basic veterinary pack and marking tape, and headed out. He told himself it would be another simple intervention, an injured animal guided back toward water or humanely dealt with if the wound was beyond recovery. He had handled such situations countless times. What unsettled him was not the deer, but the implication that someone had been operating near a protected boundary. He found the first drops of blood less than half an hour later. They stained the pine needles in irregular patterns, bright enough to still glisten in the filtered sunlight. He crouched low, studied the spacing, the way the trail of damage narrowed and widened. The deer had not fled in blind panic. It had been moving with strange deliberation, slowing at odd intervals, almost pacing itself. Marcus followed, careful to mark his path in memory. The forest around him thickened gradually, the undergrowth rising, the air cooling as the land dipped toward a low basin he rarely visited. The trail grew more erratic. There were moments when the blood seemed to stop entirely, only to reappear several yards ahead as if the animal had somehow paused its own bleeding. The ground bore the prints of hooves, but they were not the frantic scatter Marcus expected from a wounded animal. Instead, they pointed forward in a near straight line, guiding him deeper into territory he knew only in outline. He checked his bearings. According to the map stored in his mind, he should have been approaching a strip of old-growth trees that formed a natural barrier between patrol sectors. Yet nothing about this area felt familiar. The usual landmarks were absent, replaced by an unsettling symmetry in the growth of the forest. The trees seemed closer together, their trunks aligned in subtle arcs rather than the random scatter he was accustomed to reading. The radio at his shoulder crackled softly. He lifted it, spoke his identifier, waited for the reassuring hiss of response. Instead, he received only static. That was not unheard of in the deeper zones, but he had not expected it here. He lowered the device, feeling the first stirrings of irritation and unease. He told himself that the terrain must be interfering, that the hills had more influence than he realized. The blood trail led him to a dense line of trees that rose like a wall before him. The deer had been there only moments earlier. He saw a flash of movement ahead, a pale blur vanishing into the shadows. He broke into a controlled jog, heart steady, muscles working on memory more than thought. Then he heard the scream. It tore through the forest in a way that froze him mid-step. It was not the cry of a predator, nor the alarm of prey. It carried a pitch that clawed at his nerves, a rawness that made no sense in the mouth of any animal he knew. It lingered longer than a beast could manage, bending at the end in a way that felt disturbingly intentional. Marcus's first instinct was not fear, but disbelief. He cataloged sounds for a living, knew the voices of this land. That noise did not belong to any of them. The scream echoed, or perhaps it did not. It was impossible to tell. It seemed to come from just beyond the line of trees ahead, a place his eyes could not yet penetrate. He tightened his grip on the strap of his pack, pushed forward, brushing past low branches and thorns that snagged at his uniform. What he saw next erased the last of his assumptions. Where the forest should have continued in tangled density, there was a perfect opening. A circle cut into the tree line so clean and smooth it might have been drawn with a compass. The branches curved inward toward its edges, thinning as they approached the boundary, as if the trees themselves had decided to avoid that space. The ground at its base was undisturbed. No sawdust, no splintered wood, no flattened trail of machinery or feet. The blood trail ended precisely at the threshold, and then there was nothing. Marcus stared, unable to reconcile the geometry with the living chaos of the woods around him. He knelt and pressed his fingers into the soil, searching for the smallest clue of human interference. There was none. It was as though the circle had always been there, invisible until now. Beyond the opening, he glimpsed a narrow path. It was overgrown, but unmistakably a trail, its edges pressed down by countless passages. The scream had come from that direction. He checked his radio again, felt the empty hiss mock his caution. The rules he had lived by for decades were clear. Alone, out of contact, no backup, he should turn around and report what he had found. Instead, he stepped forward, crossing the threshold and entering a place that, moments earlier, had not existed in his world. The moment Marcus West stepped through the perfect circle in the tree line, he felt as if he had crossed an invisible border that no map acknowledged. The forest behind him still existed. He could see it if he turned his head, yet it already seemed distant, slightly out of focus, like a memory that had begun to fade even while it was still happening. The air itself was different. It was heavier, carrying a stale dampness that clung to his skin and filled his lungs with a scent he could not immediately identify. It was not rot and not smoke, not the metallic edge of blood nor the sweetness of pine sap. It was something muted, as though all the ordinary fragrances of the forest had been pressed into a single dull note. The trail ahead was narrow, barely wide enough for one person to pass without brushing against the surrounding undergrowth. Marcus moved cautiously, his boots sinking into soil that seemed darker and softer than the ground he had just left. Each step made less noise than it should have, as if the earth were swallowing sound. He turned slightly to look back at the circle, wanting to fix its position in his mind, but the line of trees behind him had already begun to blend together in a way that unsettled him. The geometry he had seen moments earlier was still there, yet the sharpness of its edges had dulled. He told himself that it was nothing more than a trick of light, that his eyes were adjusting to the shade after the brighter clearing. But the unease did not go away. He tried his radio again. The static was stronger now, an aggressive hiss that drowned out his voice the instant he spoke. He clipped the device back to his shoulder with more force than necessary, feeling the weight of isolation settle over him. The scream echoed in his mind, replaying itself in fragments. The sound had not been loud in the conventional sense. It had not boomed or reverberated like the call of a large animal. Instead, it had cut through the forest with a surgical precision, slicing through layers of distance and foliage until it was impossible to ignore. It was the sound of pain, but also of intent. That was what troubled him most. Marcus advanced along the path, keeping his movements deliberate. He scanned the ground for traps, for the glint of wire or the unnatural alignment of sticks that might indicate a snare. The trail was old, older than any illegal footpath he had ever encountered, but it was maintained in its own quiet way. Branches had been broken at regular intervals, not hacked apart, but bent and pressed back into the undergrowth so they would not obstruct passage. The pattern was subtle, something only a trained eye would recognize, and Marcus could not help but admire the patience it implied even as it alarmed him. The scream came again, faint this time as though it were being muffled by something thick and heavy. Marcus paused, closed his eyes, and listened. He tried to place the sound in the three-dimensional map of the forest he carried in his head, but the acoustics here were wrong. The call seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, without the usual delays or distortions that would help him judge distance. It felt closer than it should have been, and that proximity set his heart racing. He forced himself to keep moving. The responsibility that had defined his career would not allow him to retreat without understanding what he had found. He imagined a person caught in a trap, bleeding out in a place where no one would ever think to look. He imagined a frightened hiker who had wandered too far and found something he was never meant to see. The images fueled his steps, but they also sharpened his awareness of how completely he had left the familiar world behind. The deeper he went, the more the forest seemed to change its behavior around him. Birds were absent, their usual chatter replaced by an oppressive stillness that pressed against his ears. Insects did not buzz at the corners of his vision. Even the wind appeared to have lost interest in this corridor, its whispers dying out before they could reach him. Marcus had walked through the quiet aftermath of storms and fires, through areas where life retreated temporarily in the face of devastation. But this was different. This silence felt curated. He noticed then that the deer tracks, which had vanished so abruptly at the circle, were not entirely gone. Here and there along the path he could make out the faint impression of a hoof, not pressed deeply into the soil but just enough to suggest presence. They were spaced evenly, too evenly, as if the animal had moved without fear or haste. A wounded deer did not walk like that. A wounded deer fled until it collapsed or it hid in water, trying to lose the scent of blood. Whatever had led this creature here had overridden its instincts. Marcus slowed, his eyes tracing the faint marks on the ground. The path dipped gently, descending into a shallow hollow that was darker than the surrounding forest. He felt a subtle pressure in his ears, the sensation one experienced when entering a high-altitude cabin or descending in an elevator. It was slight, but unmistakable. He swallowed, equalizing, and continued. There were signs of human activity now, small and easily missed. A length of translucent fishing line strung low between two saplings, not meant to catch, but to announce. A shallow notch carved into the bark of a birch tree at chest height, the wood beneath weathered but still visible. Marcus catalogued these details with growing dread. Whoever had created this place had done so with an intimate understanding of how people like him moved through the forest. These were not the crude markers of an amateur or the careless traces of a trespasser. They were the fingerprints of someone who had lived here long enough to learn the park's blind spots. The scream came a third time, closer than before, and Marcus felt his chest tighten. He was no longer thinking about regulations or protocols. The trail had become a lifeline, drawing him toward a destination he could not yet see, but could already feel looming ahead. His thoughts circled around the same impossible questions. Who could survive out here for long enough to build such a network? Why hide it behind a doorway that defied the very logic of nature? As he descended further, the light changed. The canopy above him thickened, blotting out the sky in irregular patches, and the world took on the greenish gloom of deep water. He smelled smoke now, faint but unmistakable, and something else beneath it, an old metallic tang that made him think of rust and dried blood. His heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his pace steady, afraid that any sudden movement might trigger a trap he had not yet seen. The path curved gently to the left, then straightened, and in the distance he caught sight of a shape that did not belong among the trees. At first, he thought it was a boulder, its outline softened by moss and shadow, but as he drew near, the lines resolved into angles too sharp for stone. A roof line, sagging slightly at the edges, emerged from the gloom. The scream did not come again, but the silence that replaced it felt heavier than any sound. Marcus stopped at the edge of the hollow and studied the structure. It was a cabin, half buried in the terrain, its walls darkened by age and weather. It should not have been there. He knew this part of the park well enough to swear that no building had ever been authorized in this zone. The absence of windows on the side facing him made it look blind, as though it were deliberately refusing to acknowledge his presence. He took a step closer, then another, his senses stretched taut. The trail ended at the cabin's threshold, its worn earth giving way to a patch of ground that bore the marks of repeated passage. He could see where the undergrowth had been pushed aside, where the soil had been compacted by many feet over many years. Whatever lay beyond this door had been drawing people and animals alike into its orbit, hidden behind a scream that should not have existed and a circle that should not have been possible. With a final glance back toward the direction of the invisible doorway, Marcus moved toward the cabin, unaware that the forest behind him was already beginning to forget the shape of the path he had taken to get there. Marcus lingered at the edge of the hollow longer than he intended, studying the cabin from a distance as though the extra few seconds might reveal something crucial. The silence was so complete that it felt like pressure against his eardrums, a physical presence rather than the absence of sound. He had learned to trust the smallest deviations in the forest's behavior, and everything about this place deviated. Even the shadows clinging to the cabin seemed thicker, as if the light itself hesitated to settle on its walls. He forced himself to breathe slowly and stepped forward. The ground here was softer than it should have been, almost spongy beneath his boots, and he realized with a shiver that it was not soil alone, but layers of decomposed leaves and needles pressed together by years of traffic. The path that had led him here was no longer obvious behind him. He turned slightly to orient himself, but the narrow corridor he had followed had already begun to blur into the surrounding growth, as though the forest were closing ranks in his wake. He raised his phone and watched the GPS indicator struggle. It caught a signal for a moment, flickered, then slid several yards off its true position before freezing altogether. He knew the limitations of satellite tracking and dense canopy, yet this was worse than anything he had seen in his 2 decades on duty. He tried to align the device with the sun, estimating direction the old way, but the hollow was deep enough that even midday light barely filtered through. He felt a prickling unease at the base of his skull. Without reliable orientation, every step forward increased the distance between him and the world that made sense. As he approached the cabin, he noticed the first unmistakable sign that this place was not abandoned. A faint line of flattened grass led around the side of the structure, not a single track, but many overlaid into a narrow lane. It was the sort of detail tourists never saw, but Marcus recognized the pattern instantly. Someone walked here often, frequently enough to keep the undergrowth from reclaiming the ground. The realization did not comfort him. It raised a more troubling question. Who could live this deep inside the park without leaving a trace anywhere else? He circled the cabin slowly, keeping a few paces back from the wall. The wood was darkened almost to black, its grain swollen by decades of moisture, yet the boards were intact. There were no signs of the rot that ate away at truly abandoned buildings. The roof sagged in the middle but did not leak, and a thin line of smoke stain traced its way out from beneath the eaves. Marcus paused there, inhaled carefully, and caught the ghost of wood smoke again. Someone had been here not long ago. The scream did not repeat itself, but its absence was almost worse. He could not shake the feeling that he had arrived at the center of a carefully constructed silence. He crouched and examined the ground near the door. The soil was pressed down in an oval shape, a makeshift mat formed by the accumulation of countless steps. There were no fresh boot prints, no crisp edges, just a general smoothness that spoke of long use rather than recent disturbance. It was as though whoever belonged to this place had learned to erase their own presence. Marcus straightened and rested his hand lightly on the door. He did not open it yet. Instead, he listened, straining for any hint of movement within. There was nothing, not even the creak of settling wood. He thought again of the scream, of the way it had sounded trapped and yet deliberate. He imagined someone inside, waiting, perhaps aware of his arrival, perhaps counting on the forest to do the work of concealment for them. He pushed the door open. The interior was dim, lit only by a thin shaft of light that slipped through a crack in the roof. Dust motes drifted lazily in its beam, and the air carried the same muted scent he had noticed on the trail, a mixture of smoke, old iron, and something faintly animal. The room was larger than he had expected, its low ceiling supported by beams that had been reinforced with metal brackets. A table stood in the center, its surface bare but for the faint outlines where objects had been moved again and again. The walls were lined with shelves that held containers of various sizes, most of them empty but meticulously cleaned. He stepped inside, his boots whispering against the compacted earth floor. To his right, he saw the first set of tools. Knives of different lengths hung from pegs, their blades dull with use but carefully maintained. A coil of rope lay beneath them, its fibers worn smooth by handling. Further along the wall, he spotted a series of metal traps stacked neatly one atop another, each one closed and oiled, ready to be set. He had confiscated enough illegal equipment in his career to recognize the difference between a careless poacher's stash and a professional's kit. This was the latter. The far wall held the most disturbing display. Maps of the park were pinned there, overlapping in places, their edges frayed with age. These were not the glossy guides sold at visitor centers, but detailed topographic charts, the kind reserved for internal use. Routes were marked in pencil, patrol schedules annotated in tight, economical script. Red circles dotted the paper at irregular intervals, some labeled with dates, others with nothing more than a single word that Marcus could not read from where he stood. His pulse quickened as he realized what those marks represented. They were too numerous to be coincidence, too evenly spread to be random. Below the maps lay a scattering of newspaper clippings held in place by thumbtacks. He moved closer, reading the faded headlines. Reports of missing hikers, of search efforts that had been called off after weeks of fruitless scouring, of animals found dead in places that made no ecological sense. The dates stretched back decades, forming a timeline of quiet disappearances that had never been connected. Until now. He felt the weight of that knowledge settle over him, heavy and cold. This cabin was not a hideout. It was an archive. A soft sound outside made him freeze. It was not loud enough to be the snap of a branch, not distinct enough to be the footfall of a large animal. It was the kind of noise that might be produced by metal brushing against wood, by a tool being lifted from a hook, by someone adjusting their grip on a heavy object. Marcus did not move, his senses straining to parse the quiet. The scream did not return. Instead, there was the sense of proximity, of another presence occupying the same pocket of forest, invisible but near enough to matter. Marcus backed away from the wall of maps, his eyes darting to the door. He realized with a surge of dread that he had no clear memory of the path he had taken to reach the cabin. The forest beyond the threshold looked the same as it always had, dense and indifferent, yet he knew now that it could rearrange itself without warning. He took a step toward the door, then another, keeping his movements slow and controlled. The air outside seemed thicker than before, and he could swear that the trees were leaning inward, their branches knitting together in subtle, imperceptible ways. Somewhere behind him, a piece of metal rang softly, like a bell muffled by cloth. Marcus did not wait to hear it again. He pushed through the doorway and into the hollow, his mind already racing ahead to the only safe conclusion he could reach. Whatever this place was, whatever logic governed the circle and the trail and the cabin, it was not content to be discovered. And if he did not leave soon, it might decide to keep him. Marcus stepped back into the hollow with a sense that the air itself had tightened around him. The door to the cabin creaked faintly behind his shoulder as it settled, the sound unnaturally loud in the dense silence that ruled this place. For a moment, he simply stood there, eyes closed, listening. Nothing answered him. No rustle of leaves, no distant bird call, no whisper of wind moving through branches. It was as if the hollow had been hollowed out of the forest's ordinary life, a pocket where sound went to die. He forced himself to circle the cabin slowly, keeping several feet between his body and the walls. The outside of the structure looked older than anything he had seen in this sector of the park. The wood was grayed and furred with lichen, yet it was not collapsing. Whoever had built it had chosen their materials carefully, reinforcing weak points with scavenged metal plates and replacing damaged boards long before they could rot through. He noticed thin wires threaded through the underbrush near the back wall, almost invisible unless one knew exactly how to look. They were not traps in the usual sense, but alarms, delicate as spider silk and just as purposeful. A smell of cold ash hung near the chimney. Marcus touched the stones and felt a trace of warmth that had no business lingering in a place that appeared deserted. It told him more clearly than any footprint that someone had been here within hours, perhaps minutes. He thought of the faint sound he had heard inside, the muted ring of metal on wood, and the realization sharpened into something close to fear. He was not alone. He returned to the door and slipped inside again, careful this time to leave it ajar. The light had shifted slightly, the narrow beam through the roof now illuminating a different portion of the room. Where, before, he had been struck by the maps, he now noticed the smaller details that filled the gaps between them. There were shelves of jars, each labeled in neat handwriting, some holding powders that had settled into compacted layers, others filled with dried leaves and shredded bark. A low bench held tools for working hide, its surface polished by countless hours of use. Everything here spoke of routine, of a life lived in deliberate isolation. Marcus moved deeper into the room, his eyes drawn back to the wall of clippings. He recognized some of the names, remembered briefings that had ended in frustration and the resigned words that followed, presumed lost, search suspended. He had been on a few of those teams himself, combing miles of forest without ever suspecting that the missing had not vanished into random wilderness, but had been absorbed by a system that cataloged their disappearance as carefully as a scientist records data. On a small table beneath the maps lay a notebook. He hesitated, then picked it up. The pages were thick and yellowed, filled with cramped script that alternated between meticulous records and bursts of erratic, almost frantic scrawling. He saw dates, weather conditions, short phrases that described animal movements or human patterns, and symbols he could not decipher. In the margins were notes about silence, about sound bending and vanishing, about doors that did not exist until they were needed. Marcus closed the book slowly, feeling a coldness spread through his chest. Whoever had written this was not merely hiding from the park. They were studying it, experimenting with its blind spots. A noise outside made him flinch. This time it was unmistakable. A footstep, careful and controlled, too deliberate to belong to any animal native to this forest. Marcus's hand went instinctively to the small sidearm he carried, though he knew that any confrontation here would end badly. He edged toward the doorway, trying to keep his breathing steady. Through the gap, he saw movement. Not a clear shape, but the suggestion of it. A shadow that did not quite match the contours of the trees. It paused, as if listening, and Marcus realized with a jolt that the silence here was not passive. It was enforced. Sound was being absorbed or redirected, stolen from the world and hidden away. He stepped outside, letting the door swing wider so it would not betray him with a sudden creak. The hollow seemed darker now. The light above filtered through a thicker weave of branches. The flattened grass path he had followed to the cabin was still visible, but it looked narrower, its edges blurred. He told himself that nothing had changed, that this was simply his mind grasping at patterns, but the unease did not recede. He moved along the side of the cabin, keeping to the shadows, trying to spot the person whose presence he felt so strongly. He saw nothing, yet the sense of being observed intensified, a pressure between his shoulder blades that made him want to turn and run. Instead, he continued to scan his surroundings, cataloging every detail that might help him find his way back. A distinctive knot in a pine trunk, a cluster of pale mushrooms at the base of a fallen log, a faint discoloration in the soil where water pooled after rain. The trail that led away from the cabin was still there, but it was less defined than before. It was as though the forest were erasing it in real time, drawing branches and leaves into the space he had just vacated. Marcus followed it anyway, moving faster now, no longer caring about stealth. He needed to reach the circle, to cross back into the park he knew before whatever governed this place decided to close the door on him. As he climbed out of the hollow, he heard the metal sound again, closer this time, a muted clink that sent a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. He broke into a jog, eyes flicking constantly to either side, expecting at any moment to see a figure emerge from the gloom. None did, but the forest itself seemed to react to his haste. Branches snagged at his sleeves, roots rose beneath his feet, the ground subtly reshaping itself to slow his progress. He burst out of the hollow and into the corridor where the circle should have been. He skidded to a halt, his breath leaving him in a ragged exhale. There was nothing there. The wall of trees stood unbroken, their trunks interlaced with vines and undergrowth in a pattern that looked utterly natural. Marcus stared, disbelief flooding him. He stepped closer, pressed his palms against the bark, searched for the telltale thinning of branches, the impossible geometry he had seen only minutes before. There was no trace of it. The doorway that had carried him into this hidden pocket of forest had vanished as completely as the deer tracks that had led him there. Behind him, the faint sound of metal on wood came again, patient and unhurried, and Marcus understood that he was no longer simply lost. He was being kept. Marcus stood facing the seamless wall of trees, his palms still pressed against the bark where the perfect circle had been only moments earlier. The forest gave him nothing back. No hint of geometry, no thinning of branches, no subtle curve to betray the doorway that had delivered him into this place. It was as if the woods had inhaled and swallowed the opening hole, smoothing itself over the wound. His pulse thundered in his ears, and for the first time in many years he felt the true weight of isolation. Not the familiar solitude of a long patrol, but a deeper estrangement, the sensation of being unmoored from the rules that had governed his entire career. He forced himself to step back, knowing that panic would only make him careless. The metal sound came again behind him, soft but deliberate, as though someone were handling equipment with the confidence of habit. Marcus turned slowly, scanning the corridor he had followed from the hollow. It no longer looked like a path. Branches drooped into the space, narrowing it, and the ground appeared less trodden, the flattened grass beginning to lift as if it had been pressed there days ago rather than minutes. The forest was not static here, it was adjusting. He took a few careful steps away from the vanished doorway, angling himself toward the faintest memory of where the trail had led. Every instinct he possessed told him that he was being herded, not chased but guided, his options closing in subtle increments. He lifted his foot and nearly caught it on a thin line stretched low across the corridor, a filament so fine it was invisible unless the light struck it just right. He crouched, heart pounding, and traced the line with his eyes until he found where it was anchored to a sapling on one side and a half-buried stake on the other. It was not meant to trip him. It was meant to tell someone that he had passed. Marcus eased around the filament and continued on, his breathing shallow and controlled. He told himself that he was not yet in immediate danger, that whoever occupied this place had gone to great lengths to conceal it rather than defend it openly. But the sounds in the forest contradicted that comforting logic. He heard the faint clink again, then the whisper of movement, never quite close enough to pinpoint, always hovering at the edge of perception. It was like walking through a room where someone was rearranging the furniture behind his back. The scream returned, distant but unmistakable, and this time Marcus felt no doubt that it was human. It carried a hoarse quality that no animal could mimic, a pleading cadence that scraped raw at his nerves. He stopped, torn between the urge to follow the sound and the desperate need to find a way out. The scream did not last long. It broke off abruptly, as though a hand had been clamped over a mouth, and the silence that followed was so abrupt it made his head ring. He closed his eyes and tried to map the space around him, drawing on the discipline that had guided him through storms and night patrols and search operations that lasted days. He imagined the hollow behind him, the cabin crouched at its center like a spider, the trail that had brought him here now fading into indistinctness. He reminded himself that the forest could not truly rearrange itself, that his perception must be skewed by stress. But when he opened his eyes, the corridor looked even less defined than before, the edges of the path dissolving into a blur of green and shadow. He moved on, faster now, careful not to run outright, but no longer bothering with the stealth that had marked his earlier progress. He needed to put distance between himself and whatever was manipulating this place, and he needed to reach a point where the rules he understood applied again. His boots sank into the earth, which felt looser with every step, as if it were being churned from below. He nearly stumbled when the ground dipped unexpectedly, catching himself on the trunk of a tree that leaned at a slight angle he did not remember seeing. Another sound followed him. Not metal this time, but breath. It was faint, the merest disturbance of air, yet it had rhythm to it, the cadence of lungs filling and emptying. Marcus did not turn. He knew that if he did, he would break whatever fragile momentum he had built, and that hesitation might be all the opening his unseen companion required. He pressed on, his senses stretched to the breaking point, aware of every rustle, every shift of shadow, every deceptive patch of light that might conceal a figure. He thought of the maps he had seen on the cabin wall, the careful circles and annotations that turned the park into a chessboard. This place was not simply a hiding spot. It was a network, a system designed to exploit the gaps in patrol coverage, the blind spots of technology, the predictable habits of men like him. The scream, he realized, might be nothing more than another tool, a way to draw the curious and the conscientious into the maze. The forest tightened around him, branches brushed his shoulders, then scraped, then began to snag in earnest, forcing him to slow. He ducked beneath a low limb and felt something tug at his pack, a brief resistance that made him spin around. There was nothing there, only the trail he had just walked, now looking oddly untouched. The metal sound rang out again, closer than ever, and he imagined a hand reaching for a tool, a device that would end this pursuit without ever revealing its owner. He broke into a run then, heedless of the noise he made. He had passed the point where caution could save him. His only chance lay in reaching the circle and forcing the forest to acknowledge the boundary he had crossed earlier. He barreled through undergrowth that tore at his uniform, his breath coming in harsh bursts that echoed too loudly in his own ears. The scream did not come again, but he felt its absence as keenly as he had felt its presence, a reminder of the stakes he no longer had the luxury to contemplate. He burst through a curtain of hanging vines and into a space that should have held the doorway. Instead, he found himself staring at the same unbroken line of trees he had encountered moments earlier. He skidded to a halt, his boots carving shallow furrows in the soft earth. His mind reeled. This was the place. He was certain of it. The knot in the pine trunk, the cluster of pale mushrooms, the faint depression in the ground where water pooled after rain. Every landmark he had memorized was here, but the circle was not. Panic surged, hot and dizzying, threatening to unravel the careful discipline that had kept him alive until now. He pressed his hands to the bark again, as he had before, searching for the subtle give that had marked the boundary. There was none. The trees were solid, their roots gripping the soil with implacable certainty. Behind him, the whisper of breath grew louder, no longer content to remain a suggestion. Marcus staggered back, his heart hammering so hard he felt it in his throat. He looked left and right along the tree line, desperate for any sign of curvature, any hint that the forest was lying to him. The corridor he had followed was almost gone now, its edges bleeding into the undergrowth until it was nothing more than a faint discoloration in the leaves. The forest was hiding the path, and with it, his escape. He forced himself to stillness, closing his eyes for a single, precious moment. He pictured the circle as he had first seen it, the impossible precision of its edge, the way the branches had thinned as they approached its boundary. He imagined the angle of the light, the position of the sun filtering through the canopy, the way the air had felt different on the other side. When he opened his eyes again, he did not rush forward. He let his gaze soften, letting the rigid focus of panic dissolve into a broader awareness. There, just barely, he saw it. Not a hole, not a circle, but a discrepancy, a place where the vertical lines of the trunks bent ever so slightly, where the rhythm of the forest faltered. It was nothing he could have described to anyone else, but it was enough. He stepped toward it, then stopped short, catching another thin filament strung at chest height, this one designed not to announce but to ensnare. The breath behind him grew louder, resolving into a presence that was no longer content to remain unseen. Marcus did not turn to face it. He slipped around the filament, his movements economical despite the tremor that threatened to take over his limbs, and lunged toward the faint irregularity in the trees. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. He was running into solid wood, into the indifferent wall of the forest that had already erased his path once before. Then the air changed. It was as if he had plunged into cold water, the pressure shifting around him in an instant, the heavy dampness lifting from his lungs. Sound rushed back in a chaotic wave. The whisper of leaves, the distant call of a bird, the familiar rustle of life that had been missing in the hidden corridor. Marcus stumbled forward and fell to one knee, gasping, his senses reeling from the sudden transition. He did not wait to confirm what he already felt in his bones. He scrambled to his feet and ran, not along any path but through the living forest he had known for decades, crashing through brush, slipping on roots, guided only by the desperate need to put as much distance as possible between himself and the place that had nearly claimed him. Behind him there was no pursuit, no scream, no metallic ring to mark his passage. The forest had let him go. He did not stop until the familiar bars of cell signal flickered to life on his phone. When they did, he collapsed against a tree, the bark rough and reassuring beneath his palms, and made the call that would set in motion a chain of events he could no longer control. Marcus stayed pressed against the rough bark of the tree long after the phone connected, his chest rising and falling in ragged, uneven bursts. The forest around him sounded suddenly loud, almost aggressive in its normalcy. Birds called from somewhere high in the canopy. Insects buzzed close to his ears, and the wind pushed through the branches with a steady whisper that would have been comforting on any other day. Now it felt unreal, like the aftermath of a nightmare when the room looks familiar, but the terror has not yet loosened its grip. When he finally managed to speak, his voice was hoarse and unsteady, but he forced himself to deliver the facts with the precision drilled into him over decades. Coordinates, or what his phone believed were coordinates. Description of the circular opening, the trail that should not exist, the hidden cabin, the equipment, the maps, the clippings. He heard the hesitation on the other end of the line, the careful pauses as the dispatcher tried to decide whether this was a seasoned ranger reporting a genuine anomaly or a man shaken by isolation and exhaustion. Marcus understood the doubt. If he had not lived it, he would have questioned it too. They told him to stay where he was. Backup was being organized. A team would meet him at the nearest accessible point. He acknowledged, ended the call, and sank down at the base of the tree, his legs finally given in. The adrenaline that had carried him through the hidden corridor drained away, leaving behind a trembling fatigue that spread from his spine into every muscle. He waited, counting the seconds by the rhythm of his breathing. In the spaces between heartbeats, fragments of the forest he had escaped replayed in his mind. The softened earth that swallowed sound. The invisible filaments strung like spider silk. The pressure in his ears as if he had been descending into some sealed chamber beneath the world. Above all, the scream. The memory of it made his stomach clench even now, though the normal forest noises should have drowned it out. Time passed in strange fits and starts. He checked his phone, watched the signal bars flicker but hold. He forced himself to drink water, to ground his body in simple actions. Eventually, he heard voices in the distance, human voices carried by the wind and the unmistakable cadence of colleagues calling out to one another. Relief washed through him so strongly it left him lightheaded. They found him near a shallow ravine that bordered a well-used patrol path. To anyone else, it was an ordinary spot, a place where the forest opened just enough to let light spill down in broad columns. Marcus led them back the way he had come, talking constantly, pointing out landmarks he had burned into his memory during his flight. The knot in the pine trunk, the pale mushrooms, the shallow basin where rainwater collected. His words came faster as they moved, driven by the fear that if he did not keep speaking, the place would vanish completely from his grasp. When they reached the line of trees where the circle should have been, he felt the same hollow drop in his stomach he had felt when he first realized it was gone. He stepped forward, raised his hands, and showed them exactly where the doorway had opened. There was nothing to show. Just a dense tangle of trunks and vines, indistinguishable from any other section of the park. They searched anyway. They spread out in careful formation, scanning the ground for signs of disturbance, climbing slight rises to look for any unnatural alignment in the trees. They found no trail, no hollow, no cabin, not a single piece of fishing line or a hint of flattened grass. The forest here was pristine, untouched by anything larger than the animals that belonged to it. One of the younger rangers gave Marcus a long, searching look, not unkind but edged with concern. Another suggested they widen the search radius. They did, pushing deeper into the surrounding terrain, but the result was the same. The longer they looked, the more Marcus began to doubt his own senses. It was as though the place had never existed at all. They returned to the station with nothing to document. No photos, no physical evidence, only Marcus's account. The official report was necessarily cautious. possible stress response, disorientation in low signal area, no anomalies found. He signed it with a hand that still shook, aware that the words on the page bore no resemblance to the reality he had experienced. But he could not let it go. In the days that followed, Marcus found himself replaying every moment, searching for patterns. He began to keep his own journal, a plain notebook he carried in his pack on every patrol. He recorded the weather, the wind direction, the humidity, the quality of light filtering through the canopy. He marked the exact times when his radio faltered, when the forest seemed too quiet, when animal behavior deviated from the norm. He did not tell anyone about this personal project. He had seen the looks his colleagues exchanged when they thought he was not watching. Sympathy tinged with skepticism, concern layered over disbelief. He returned alone to the area more than once, careful to choose days when his presence would not raise questions. Each time he approached the coordinates where the circle had been, he felt the same subtle shift in the air, the same sense of crossing into a different register of the forest. Yet the doorway never revealed itself. He would stand among the trees, turning slowly, letting his gaze drift rather than focus, searching for the discrepancy that had guided him out that first time. Nothing answered. Weeks passed. Reports trickled in of oddities that would once have gone unnoticed. A camera trap that stopped transmitting for hours at a time despite full batteries. A ranger who swore he had followed a set of fresh boot prints only to lose them in a patch of ground that showed no sign of disturbance. A tourist who complained of hearing a scream deep in the park. A sound that had left them shaken but left no trace. These incidents were written off individually, lost in the steady flow of minor anomalies that marked any large natural area. Marcus alone saw the thread connecting them. He compared dates, weather conditions, patterns of patrol coverage. Slowly, a picture began to form. The disruptions clustered around certain atmospheric states, heavy humidity following days of heat, low wind, the particular angle of afternoon light that flattened shadows and erased depth. It was as if the forest opened itself under specific conditions, offering access to something that preferred to remain unseen. One afternoon, while reviewing old case files, Marcus noticed a correlation that made his hands go cold. Several of the disappearances he had seen pinned to the cabin wall had occurred during weeks that matched his emerging pattern almost perfectly. The people who had vanished had not simply wandered off. They had stepped into a gap. The implications of that realization weighed on him more heavily than the fear he had felt in the hollow. This was not an isolated anomaly that could be quarantined or dismissed. It was a system that had been operating beneath the surface of the park for years, perhaps decades, unnoticed because it did not leave conventional evidence behind. His sleep suffered. He woke at night to phantom echoes of the scream, to the imagined brush of branches against his shoulders, to the sensation of air pressing in on him from all sides. He began to hear things in the forest that no one else did, or at least that no one else admitted to hearing. A muted metallic ring when the wind shifted just so. A hush that fell too suddenly, as though the world had been cupped in a giant hand. The next time the conditions aligned, he felt it in his bones. The air was thick, the light strangely diffuse, the usual background noise of the park subdued. He found himself walking toward the same sector without fully realizing he had made the decision. He stopped only when he reached the familiar ravine, the last place where the forest still felt unquestionably real. He did not cross it. Instead, he stood at the edge, his journal heavy in his pocket, and listened. The scream did not come. Neither did the circle reveal itself. Yet he knew with a certainty that had nothing to do with evidence that the hidden corridor was not gone. It was waiting, responding to variables he had only begun to understand, choosing its moments with a patience that dwarfed his own. When he finally turned back toward the station, the forest behind him sighed in a way he could not quite explain, a subtle release of tension that made him wonder whether he had been closer to the threshold than he realized. The official search ended with the quiet finality of paperwork. No matter how many times Marcus retraced the route with supervisors, no matter how wide they widened the grid, or how carefully they documented each fallen branch and shallow depression, the forest refused to yield anything that resembled the world he had stumbled into. The maps on their tablets showed nothing unusual. The drones captured nothing but endless canopy stitched together by sunlight. The dogs followed his scent for a while, and then lost it in a perfectly ordinary patch of ground. In the final report, the language was careful and bloodless, filled with phrases like "area clear" and no evidence of illegal structures. The words were not cruel, but they were devastating all the same. At first, Marcus thought that the frustration would fade with time, that the forest would slowly reassert itself as the place he had always known. Instead, the opposite happened. Each patrol only deepened his unease. He found himself scrutinizing stretches of trail that he had once walked without thinking, stopping to listen to the way sound carried, noting how the wind bent the grass, how shadows pooled beneath certain clusters of trees. It was as if he had been granted a glimpse of a hidden layer of reality, and now could not stop searching for it, even though the doorway had sealed itself behind him. His colleagues treated him differently. No one said anything openly, but he saw the glances when he entered a room, the way conversations dipped when he passed. They were not mocking him. If anything, their concern made the distance harder to bear. A few of the younger rangers asked him questions in private, not about the circle or the cabin, but about how he was sleeping, whether he needed time off. He gave them polite answers and kept his journal hidden in the bottom of his locker. The journal became his anchor. He filled it with dates, times, weather conditions, stray impressions that he could not fit into any official format. He noted when the forest seemed too quiet and when the radio crackled without reason. He wrote about the weight in the air that preceded storms and how, on certain days, that weight lingered long after the clouds had passed. He tried to be scientific about it, to build a model from the chaos, but the truth was that the patterns only made sense to him. They were stitched together from memory and instinct, from the residue of fear that had never quite left his body. Occasionally, a report would cross his desk that made his pulse spike. A hiker who swore they had heard a scream far from any trail. A family who returned from a day trip missing one of their backpacks without understanding how it had been lost. A remote camera that recorded nothing but static for an hour before resuming its usual watch over an empty clearing. Each incident was explained away, absorbed into the endless noise of a living park, but Marcus added them to his private ledger, watching as the same conditions appeared again and again in the margins of his notes. He stopped trying to convince anyone else. The evidence he had seen had never existed in a form that could be shared, and the forest had been thorough in its erasure. The maps in the cabin, the jars, the traps, the clippings that chronicled a shadow history of disappearances, all of it had dissolved back into the wilderness as if it had been nothing more than a projection of his own mind. Yet, he knew that projection could not have left his boots torn and his hands raw, could not have etched the memory of that scream into the deepest part of his nervous system. On nights when sleep eluded him, he lay in the small apartment the service provided and listened to the sounds of the town beyond his window. cars passing, distant laughter, the occasional bark of a dog. He had once found those noises intrusive, a reminder that the park was never as isolated as it pretended to be. Now he clung to them, letting their ordinariness reassure him that the world still obeyed rules somewhere. Even so, there were moments when he swore he could hear a faint metallic ring beneath the hum of traffic, a note that did not belong but insisted on making itself known. The breaking point came on an afternoon that seemed by every metric entirely unremarkable. The sky was high and pale, the humidity just low enough to be comfortable, the forest alive with the steady murmur of insects and birds. Marcus was finishing a patrol near the western ridge when his radio faltered for a heartbeat and then cleared. He slowed, the hairs on his arms rising in response to a sensation he could not articulate. The air felt wrong, not heavy this time, but thin, as though a vacuum were forming just beyond his field of vision. He closed his eyes and stood still. The forest did not go silent. Instead, the sounds around him seemed to slip out of alignment, the bird calls arriving a fraction too late, the rustle of leaves lacking their usual echo. It was subtle, so subtle that he might once have dismissed it without a second thought. Now it rang in his bones. When he opened his eyes, he saw it. Not a doorway, not yet, but a suggestion of one, a curve in the vertical discipline of the trunks, a place where the pattern of growth faltered just enough to betray itself. His heart thudded, not with panic this time, but with a strange, steady resolve. He knew that if he stepped forward, he might never come back. He knew that whatever intelligence governed the hidden corridor had noticed him as clearly as he had noticed it. He did not move. Instead, he reached into his pack and pulled out his journal, flipping to the blank page he had left for the next anomaly. He wrote the date, the time, the conditions, his hands surprisingly steady as he documented the beginning of what he knew could become the end of his ordinary life. He did not try to capture the curve he saw with words. He did not need to. It was enough that he acknowledged it. The forest held its breath. The sounds hovered in that skewed half-world he had come to recognize, waiting to see what he would do. Marcus closed the journal and slid it back into his pack. He took a single step closer to the irregularity in the trees, not far enough to cross any boundary, just enough to let the place know that he was aware of it. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the light shifted, no more than a ripple, and the curve sharpened into something almost visible. He stepped back. The sensation passed like a wave receding from shore. The bird calls fell back into rhythm, the leaves resumed their whisper, and the forest became once again the forest he had always known. Marcus stood there for several minutes, breathing slowly, letting the ordinary world reassert itself around him. When he finally turned away, he did not feel relief. He felt acceptance. He walked back toward the station under a sky that looked exactly as it had that morning, aware that somewhere beyond the limits of his vision a door had opened and closed in the span of a heartbeat. The place no longer existed in any sense that could be mapped or proven, but it had left its mark on him all the same. He would never again patrol these woods with the easy certainty of a man who believed he knew every creek and every tree. From that day on, Marcus listened more carefully than ever before. He watched for the slight misalignments in the fabric of the forest, for the moments when sound bent and light softened and the air itself seemed to hesitate. He knew now that the park was not a single place but many layered atop one another, most of them content to remain unseen. And he knew that, sooner or later, one of those hidden layers would open its door again, not because he was searching for it, but because it had already decided that he belonged to its story. Before you leave, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Watch the following videos on the channel to uncover more stories like this, and share this video with friends who love real mysteries hidden in plain sight.